this part is in sustainability and economics is tragedy of the commons, market failure and externalities, and I'll talk a little bit about climate change and something big going on here. If I get time, I'll do that. I've got about half an hour to get through this. And I'll talk about value and pricing, social and environmental. And I just want to make the point really that the scope of what we talk here is not what you do in your economics unit. This is quite specific about the relationships between economics and sustainability. And thus we talk about the things at the start here. And the other point I make really important as we make with all the other pillars, you can't see this being separate from the other two, because arguably what the idea of economics is, it should deliver social outcomes. That's the point of economics, is not create wealth for its own sake, but to create good social benefits for people, and that it shouldn't come out at the cost of the environment, and that's what it is here. Okay. I will talk about, if I get a chance, talk about also ecological economics, which is not mainstream economics, they're quite different. The first thing we'll talk about is the tragedy of the commons, I won't actually mean here. This is based on work done by Hardin in 1968. It's quite a small book, you can read it. I've uploaded it into Blackboard. And the whole idea about the commons is this notion that he talks about in English villages and towns, where you have this so-called commons, which is usually in the middle of the village, where it's a grassed area and farmers can actually, if they want to, they can graze their cattle on, or the sheep on the commons. And what happens is that because it's not owned by anyone, it's common property, is what's called the commons, that farmers may be tempted to gradually keep adding cows or cattle or sheep to the commons. And there's two possible outcomes when this occurs. One possible outcome is that all the farmers, in a sense, cooperate, and so that you don't exceed the carrying capacity of the commons, and so they all contribute equally to that. But the other one is, this is the tragedy of the commons, is the notion of competition. That in fact, what actually happens here is that farmers distrust that another farmer may in fact put extra cows on, and because they think that might happen, they put extra cows on as a result. Because they don't want the other person to get the benefit of putting extra cows on. So what happens is all of them think the same way. They all put extra cows on, and as a result, instead of having an ongoing sustainable use of the commons with a certain number of cows, it gets overgrazed, and therefore the commons becomes degraded, and no one benefits. So in this case then, self-interest prevails in the outcome. And the tragedy is that self-interest prevailing means that everyone loses. So the notion of the commons, and that's becomes the tragedy of the commons. So the examples, for example, would be public water supply and water restrictions. The commons is in fact the water, and that we are restricted in 2 days a week to use that water. And the tragedy of the commons here is that people think, well, look, even though I'm only able to 2 days a week, I'll actually use it more than that, because I don't trust the guy down the road because he's going to do it, therefore I'll do it as well. So everyone starts to water for more than 2 days a week, and as a result, the resource gets depleted. So that's one example of that as well. Fishing is another one. This shows you the graph on the top graph there. Shows you what's happening to the catch over a certain number of years. If you look at the stock, it's actually in decline. And so again, even though fishers know that the stock is declining, they still continue to take more and more because they don't trust the fact that the other people will do that. So, and in fact, what happens with economics is that when you get lower supply, the price actually goes up. And you can see here, you get $400,000 to pay for one tuna. And therefore that actually encourages increased use of the commons because you get so much money for it as well. Firewood's another example of this, that everyone's, if you get too many people wanting to use access to forest areas for firewood, you get the situation where people will deplete the stock rather than they use it sustainably in that regard. How do you avoid the tragedy of commons? So basically, economists argue there are two ways of doing this. The first one is you regulate with licence. The second one is you let market forces do that. In other words, you privatise the resource, allow market forces to do that. If you regulate, what does that actually mean? Well, it remains in private ownership, so public ownership, and and the government actually regulates how much gets used. So you get a licence to use that. And so each farmer in this case would have a licence to have a certain number of sheep or cattle on the commons, or whatever it's going to be. We license the access to water, that kind of thing. Some economists argue, in fact, that's a very inefficient way of allocating resources because it requires extra resources, for example, monitoring and management, to actually operate that particular thing. The thing about it, though, is, and this is important for those who are supporters of regulation, you actually control the use. Therefore, you protect the commons in that regard. So it's done that way. But again, the argument about the inefficient use of that. And then you get the problem, which is a bit of an equity one. Who gets the licenses and how much access? Does every farmer get access to it? What about if there's more farmers who want to access the commons than there would be, sort of one cow per farmer? So there might be only 100 cows for sustainable use, but only 200 farmers. How do you allocate who gets that 100 cows to go on that property? So there's concerns about corruption and so on go with that. Now, if you privatise a resource, or you sell it off, so the commons you sell off, or the water resource you sell off, so you privatise it, and then what happens is it gets regulated by supply and demand, as you saw with tunes. Supply goes down, price goes up, so therefore people can't afford to access it, therefore it's controlled that way there. So the free marketeers argue that in fact prices will in fact in a sense regulate the whole thing. But there's still that incentive to overuse it. And particularly, for example, with the tuna fishery, is that you get so much for your tuna that drives the overuse of the oil as well. But the bigger problem, of course, with this whole idea is that some resources are actually difficult to privatise. How do you privatise the air we breathe, the ocean, or wetlands, that kind of thing, or underground water, which goes across the whole of different property boundaries? These things are difficult to privatise, therefore the notion of market forces is actually quite difficult to do. You can't sell the air off because the air's continually moving around the place. That leads us therefore to discussions of market failures and externalities, and that sometimes the market, even if you were to privatise a resource, the market sometimes does fail. The theory of market argues that only markets can deliver an efficient use of resource. That's what they say. They want the resource is just privatise it because then supply and demand will regulate it, and it's an efficient way of doing it. You don't have government employees regulating, therefore taking away from that. If that was the case, if the notion of supply and demand actually worked, then why do you get environmental degradation? Why do you get pollution in the first place? And if that's the case. So why do you get air pollution, water pollution? And the reason is that you get this because you have what's called external costs. They're not internalised with the industry. So things like pollution of air and pollution of water is not internal to the operation of the business. Therefore, there's no incentive to build that into their costs. So the idea is that these become what's called externalities to what's going on. So and that's the way with air pollution, because the impacts are not felt by the industry, they're felt by other people external to that. So the solution, therefore, is to internalise those things rather than making external, which I'll come to as well. So this happens when you have open access to many environmental resources, which are really regarded as what you might call common property, like air and water and those sorts of things. As I said, there's no incentive for the cost of that to be taken into account, so they get free riding by industry. They're allowed to pollute because they're not paying the cost of that. So what the argument here is that the environmental and social costs of pollution are not accounted for by industry. Therefore, you get market failure. The market has failed to take this into account. Arguably, there's this issue about governments failure of governments as well, to actually make sure that kind of happens. How do you dress up this whole idea of market failure? What can you actually do? One thing is so-called polluter pays, where they actually pay for the repair of the pollution they do. Of course, the problem with that idea is pollution's already occurred. What you want to do is to avoid pollution occurring in the first place. So while polluter pays is argued, it's probably not the way to go. It doesn't address the original problem of the whole thing. You can regulate access to that resource. So you set limits on emissions. So a government agency would say the carrying capacity of this airshed or this wetland or this commons is a certain amount, you set limits on that, but you still have the same problems we raised earlier about who gets access to licensing and the notion of potential for corruption. But what you want to do is but the best way to do this, arguably, is rather than regulation, is actually to price the resource so the real cost of what they do is internalised into their operations. And therefore there's a price incentive then not to pollute. So therefore we use a range of economic instruments. So you do put market limits on that and say profit curve. So let's look a bit more closely at these things called market instruments. What you can do is you can charge for service. So if an industry wants to put effort into the air, you charge them for it, and therefore it increases their production costs. It gives them incentive, therefore, to use cleaner technology so they don't have to have that cost of discharging to the environment. This is what this is all about. It's basically getting them to say that it costs us to discharge effluent or pollute. As a result, it might be cheaper for me not to do it in the first place. So what we're trying to do here is build those economic things in. Another way of doing this is through subsidies and incentives. So you can subsidise them using different technology or provide incentives through tax and so on if they do that kind of stuff. Another way of doing it for certain things is an idea about deposit refund scheme, which is, for example, recycling plastic bottles. You put a price, so instead of what the coke costs you $2.50, it costs you $2.60, and 10 cents of that is the cost of the bottle itself. And people collect those bottles and they reuse them and they get the money back for that. You can do enforcement incentives, so-called non-compliance fees. So if you do the right thing, you operate as normal. If you don't comply with things, you get charged a fee for non-compliance. Also things like performance bonds. So you promise you do clean technology, we take $1 million off you. If you don't do that, if you pollute, we use that $1 million to clean it up. You don't get that money back at the end of the operation. You do things called tax differentiation, a bit similar to the second one, where you set different tax rates for companies that use clean technology. You can also redefine property rights and do things like trade emissions, and I'll give an example of that when we talk about carbon in a moment. All of these do have administration costs, but at least we do internalise that, so the administration costs need to be built into that as well. But the last thing is that particular things, all of these need to have, how do you then answer the question about setting actual limits on what's the sustainable effluent discharge into an environment. You can put a charge on it, but if you don't set a limit on what goes in, you still get pollution. So I'll get to that in a while. This whole idea about evaluating the environment and externalities, it reflects the change in governments that occurred, I guess, from the 80s onwards, the so-called neoliberalist view about things, where you should price things into that. So the idea about pricing and valuing the environment as an economic resource. So the wetlands, the ocean, the air has an economic value, and therefore you put that in. And of course, the non-neoliberalists argue that yes, you can do that from an economic point of view, but how do you value the more intangible things about the environment? You can't always put economic costs on these things. So there is that debate which goes on there as well. Let's use climate change and how you mitigate climate change as an example of internalising those externalities and how it actually works. And I'm going to use the national government's proposals. And there are three proposals. I won't go into details of the actual government proposal. I'll do that when I get to climate change. But I just want to give you an overview of the three ways in which we can do that. There are three broad approaches, which is the carbon tax. There is emissions trading scheme, and the so-called incentives, so-called direct action approach. There are three ways in which you can look at controlling emission of greenhouse gases, and all of those in sets are economic measures, particularly the first two, less so the second one, the third one. The third one does involve some economics, but it's not quite as hard economics as the first two. What's a carbon tax? It's a tax on the products that have a carbon content. So petrol will cost more because it contains carbon, kerosene, coal, and manufactured plastics. You put a tax on that depending on how much carbon there is. The more carbon producers, or carbon dioxide producers, the higher the tax. So you can see what happens is that by taxing carbon, you raise the price of that product. So for example, with fossil fuels, by putting a carbon tax on, you raise the price of that. And the idea would be is that non-renewables that don't have carbon, they don't get the tax. At the moment, we have renewables are more expensive than fossil fuels. And the idea would be you put a carbon tax on, raise the price, so it's price competitive with renewables, so that therefore people will then choose this if it becomes cheaper. So that there's an economic measure to this. So the idea of putting a carbon tax is to make non-carbon fuels the same price, if not cheaper than those with carbon content. The other things I'll talk about there. And there is a problem with it though, and that is the polluter actually paying? What will happen is that arguably is that they will hand on the extra cost because of carbon tax to the consumer. So for example, electricity prices go up. Well, actually, that's probably not a bad thing if you think of it from this point of view. If price of electricity goes up, arguably people will consume less electricity, therefore our production of carbon will go down, which is in fact the point. But I guess the argument is, well, the power stations aren't paying it, we as consumers are. So that's one problem with that as well. Then there's what price to set. If you set it too high, which you've got to set it fairly high, if you set it too high, that will enormously impact on the economy. And if you set it too low, it's still, carbon fuel is still lower than the renewables, therefore people aren't going to shift their behaviour. So you need to set the right price without having an impact on the economy. And then there's a question about what to tax. It's not a simple issue. And do you exclude things from it? Is it anything with carbon, or do you exclude things? And do you, for the sake of, I guess, the people's budgets and cost of living, do you exclude petrol for cars? And in fact, this is what the government's done. Actually, trucks which use diesel will actually pay a carbon tax, whereas normal cars don't pay that. Well, as soon as you make a decision that some things are in, some things are out, it becomes a question of which one to choose, and the whole question about equity comes into there as well. There is the impact on CPI, so it's something that's certainly possible, but again, that's the point, is you want to change people's behaviour, but arguably. But then there's the issue about equity. There's certain low income players probably spend more of their income on things which are fossil fuel based and that sort of things. And there's a question of what to do with the revenue. Should you use it for offsetting other things, or should you use it for adaptation measures for climate change, or as what the government's choosing to do, which is to actually give you a cost subsidy for your electricity prices, so you don't actually feel the pain. The fundamental issue though with carbon tax is that there is no guarantee that the reductions that you set yourself will actually be met, because you're not setting a cap. You're assuming the market will actually operate, therefore reduce carbon emissions. There's no guarantee you'll reach your cap. So that's probably the most fundamental issue with carbon tax. That's why the ETS, the Emissions Trading Scheme, is a preferred model, and that's the one we're going to go across to in 2015. What we do is, at the ETS, or Emissions Trading Scheme, the first thing we do is set a cap on the total amount of carbon that can be produced. And so that's the first thing we do. Next thing is that people who want to produce carbon dioxide, burn fossil fuels, they have to buy a licence to produce that. So there's an additional cost on what they do. That licence will cost them. So there's an incentive to actually produce less carbon. But the thing is that you only allocate enough licences to equal the cap that you set yourself. Then what happens, of course, is that the licence becomes a tradable commodity. And so businesses can sell that licence and make a profit on it. So what they can then make a decision as if their licence is worth $1 million, they can sell that licence for $1 million, which means they therefore cannot, they have to use clean technology to reduce their carbon emissions right down. But it might only cost them $500,000 to actually introduce that technology, and therefore they sell the licence and make a profit of $500,000. So the licence becomes a tradable commodity and can be traded in the open market. They can offset, but we'll get to that later. So they can, another thing they can also do, as I said, is offset their emissions. What that means is they can go above their licence emissions, provided they offset somewhere like plant somewhere 2 or 3 hectares of vegetation which takes carbon out of the air, so that increase go above their licence, but they offset that by planting trees in this regard. So they can do that kind of thing. If the government wants to reduce its cap, so it sets it at say 100,000 tonnes initially, it wants to reduce it by 10,000 tonnes, what it does is it goes in the market and buys the licences worth 10,000 tonnes and pulls it out of the market. So in that way, it can actually reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So you can see an ETS works better because, first of all, you regulate what the cap is, and so you can meet that cap. And secondly, if you want to reduce the cap and reduce your emissions, the government can step in and do that. And it's market driven. It's all about the market. And you can see what we've done here. We've internalised the cost of carbon as a licence, and therefore there's an incentive to reduce the amount of carbon that you've got in the market. So the similar issues come up here. What's going to be included as with the carbon tax? What do you tax? Here, what do you include as tradable carbon? Should you include homes in that? So our home emissions, should we buy a licence to generate, to take electricity? And then the issue about offsetting. Is the offsetting only occur locally, or are you now offsetting overseas as well? Then what is the licence money? And the same issue with tax. How do you spend the licence money? Should you use that, for example, investing in clean technology? The same CPI issues, it does raise the price of things like electricity. And then there's the problem of making sure that people do as they say they're going to do. It's actually going to cost you now to actually monitor and audit those industries and their licences. That becomes pretty important part of the whole thing as well. I won't talk about the Commonwealth Clean Energy legislation. I'll do that when I get to that. The third thing, action, is the so-called direct action. And what's that? That's where governments provide incentives for business to adopt carbon-free technology. So they use revenue and they say, we'll pay you, for example, to scrub your emissions that take carbon out of the air in that regard, through grants, tax cuts and so on. What are the issues with this particular one? Well, first of all, there's no cap. As for the carbon tax, there is no cap. All you're doing is you've got a certain amount of money which you try and spend in a certain way. So how do you know you're going to reach your target? Does the employer actually pay? In fact, what's happening here is the taxpayers pay, because we're providing taxpayers money as incentives for business to reduce their carbon. So they're not actually paying for it. Why there's no CPI impact on this thing? Because there is no cost mechanisms to reduce the carbon consumption. So what I mean here is that we're using tax revenue. The benefit of doing it this way is the cost of living doesn't go up, and that's one of the benefits of this. But really, it doesn't actually lead to a good reduction in carbon. The more critical question is actually going to be affordability. A 5% target is actually affordable in government revenues. What about when we want to go for 25% reduction, which is what we want to do by 2050, a 25% reduction in that? That's going to cost 5 times the amount of money. How are we going to afford that? Do we take money out of other things like schools and hospitals and that kind of thing? Or do we introduce a separate tax to fund this thing? And if that's what you're doing, isn't that already a carbon tax anyway? And so this whole incentive thing then becomes effectively a carbon tax. And there's a problem about picking winners and losers. So when you give incentives to companies, what you're doing is you're choosing which ones to, who gets that money, and there's a potential for things like corruption to be involved in the whole thing. Okay, there is a broader issue going on here when we talk about economics, and that is, as I hinted at before, is that the environment is seen as an economic resource. So we actually, this whole idea about internalising externalities is to put a price on the environment. And so we're seeing this kind of thing. So summing up then, the key parts of the economics of this lecture. We have a thing called the tragedy of the commons, and where we have publicly owned resource, and it gets exploited if we don't regulate it or we sell it off. Then we moved on to the notion of market failure and externalities, which is, that happens because we have open access to resources like air and what have you. And the way we solve that market failure is going to be pollution. And it's because the open access to these resources are external to the operation of the business. The way we then have to operate is internalise those costs and put a price on using that commons or that resource in that through how the motivation to do that. Then we used climate change mitigation as an example of pricing the resource, which is open access resource, which is friendly to the atmosphere, and dumping carbon pollution into the atmosphere. And we saw there were three types of that. And we talked about the modern place model, which I didn't actually do,